Welcome to DS Trucks. In today's video, I want to talk about a controversial topic, and that is your brake fluid reservoir. Should you open this reservoir when you compress your calipers when doing a brake job? This is interesting because I've always loosened my brake fluid reservoir when compressing my brake calipers during a brake service, and I can't remember where I read that or why I started that practice, because I've been doing it for so long, but it is controversial. I had no idea, so I ended up talking to a friend about this, and he's like, I've never heard of that. I've never done that. It's totally unnecessary. You should never do that. So I am curious, what do you guys think? Have you heard of doing that? Are you a mechanic in the industry that maybe have more insight? But I think I heard about this in automotive school. I did go to college for brakes, front end suspension, air conditioning, engine building, and all this stuff way back in the day, right out of high school. Ended up going down a different path in life and didn't actually ever work full-time as a mechanic, but there was a lot of stuff that I kind of learned, either whether it was on my own with a book or in the automotive school, the college. So I can't remember where I read that to open the cap before compressing your calipers, but I do remember going through a lot of literature in my day as a young person, trying to figure out how to service my own brakes. So there's a lot of things that go into servicing your brakes. I've been state certified for brakes, air conditioning, front end suspension, engine building, all that stuff. So I can't remember if that's on like a test or anything, but yeah. They say clean the area before you open it. This one's already relatively clean, but you can see it's a little bit dusty. So I'm just going to use this alcohol wipe real quick and easy, something I have on hand, and that can clean that off, and it can just evaporate, leaving a relatively clean area. To be by the book, you could use brake clean, compressed air together to do this, and it would work just as good. So I'm cleaning this off right now. Now the thing about brake fluid is it's hydroscopic, and it will absorb moisture. So you do kind of want to minimize the amount of time that this system's open to the air. You wouldn't want to just open it and leave the cap off, because then you're letting all the humidity and everything in excess into the fluid. Even though there's some airflow, this system's not perfectly sealed. Pressures do equalize inside of the system. But why did I ever even bother opening the cap? If I go to compress these calipers on this truck in order to service the brakes, they will compress if the cap is on. I think it's harder, but then again, I don't ever recall trying to compress calipers with the cap on. I do feel that when I'm compressing calipers, because of me loosening the cap, typically when I compress my calipers, I'll loosen up this cap like this, and with it loose, I would just leave it like that before compressing my calipers. And I've never had like a caliper not compressing. Only time is when they have a mechanism like in the rear with the electronic parking brake, then it won't compress. But typically when I'm compressing a caliper, I'm not fighting it. There's cap removed. I'm not typically fighting a caliper. I always loosen this up so air can escape, and calipers just compress easily for me. There's not like for me, when I compress a caliper when I'm servicing brakes, I compress that caliper, and the brake caliper and the I guess you call it the bracket, the mounting bracket that holds the caliper, that stuff just swings out of the way for me, and it never is really a fight. It's never hanging up or anything. Like I say, I do in my experiences have always loosened the cap to allow that little bit of air to escape. Now my reasoning for doing this, and maybe I'm wrong, like I say, comment below on your thoughts, because I know this is controversial, but my reasoning in loosening this cap to compress everything, let's say hypothetically we're doing a brake service on a truck and all of the pads are worn low. Fronts need to be done, the rears need to be done, the rotors need to be done, all four rotors. So inside of our reservoir, we see this fluid is at the minimum mark. So this right here, the wear, I guess you could think of it as the master cylinder is telling you how much wear is existing between your rotors and pads on all the braking system. So you never really want to have to top this off, because if you fill this back to the max mark, even though as it works its way down to the min, I'm 75% full. It's hard to see the marks with the resolution. I don't know if the camera resolution is high enough, but I'm 75% to the full mark. I wouldn't want to top this off. Maybe an inexperienced person will go ahead and say, well, let me put some brake fluid in here and top it right to the max. You know, maybe a used car lot, their practice is just to fill everything to the max. Maybe some POS oil change place, their practice is just to fill everything to the max, including the brake fluid. But if this truck were to get equipped with brand new brake pads and rotors, everything would be compressed and that fluid will be back again to the maximum mark. So you wouldn't have to add brake fluid. Now let's say all the calipers, all the brake pads and rotors have wear. We're replacing everything. All 4 rotors, all the pads, everything. When we go to compress the caliper, we're essentially asking the brake fluid to close all of this space. This was, let's say at the minimum mark, we're at the min. That brake fluid is going to then, once those pistons are all 4 fully contracted, that brake fluid is going to rise all the way back to that max line. But what's happening as this truck is driven for years, I mean, for you to wear out all the pads on this truck, it would probably take 100,000 miles. I mean, we're at 22,000 now. We're at 75% on our brake fluid. Typically, I think you'd probably wear the front pads out before the rears, but I don't know. This truck being a 450, it's carrying the same size brake pad and rotor on the rear as it is on the front, and I don't know how much proportioning the system does, if it does more in the rear when you're towing, what kind of technology. It could be some technology on here that allows for some more braking in the rear under towing or when needed. I don't know. But if you were going to compress all of it, this system should have enough fluid in it in order to have no metal to metal, have worn out pads, worn out rotors, almost to the point where you're touching metal, but you're getting close to the warning tab and everything needs to be serviced, and it probably still have enough brake fluid. You'd be right at the minimum mark. So over the course of, I don't know, how long does it take to get that much wear on your brakes? In my case, it's going to take me 5 years. I mean, we're 1 year in, we're at 75%, 70%, whatever. It might take 4 or 5 years to get the brake pads worn out. Well, I go and compress these calipers, and I'm going to force 4 to 5 years worth of air, this is relatively airtight. Let's take a look at this cap. I'm going to force all that air out of the cap at one time. So looking at the bottom of this cap, you can see a rubber seal and you can see a diaphragm there. This diaphragm can pop down or whatever to allow for some pressure to equalize. But at the end of the day, with the amount of wear that you can get on this braking system, you can bet that the pressures equalize. So at the end of the day, at some point, atmospheric pressure works its way into this reservoir cap. It's not impervious to air, but it does have a diaphragm in there. How much that diaphragm is actually doing, I don't know, but that diaphragm could allow for some movement maybe of the brake fluid. It lets the brake fluid drop down a little if you're applying the brakes and everything's got to drop down fast. I've never looked inside of a brake system while it's actually functioning to know if that diaphragm moves. It probably moves just a little bit, I would imagine. I mean, they're not wasting money on caps with diaphragms if the diaphragm never does anything. But let's say 5 years goes down the line, and over that 5 years, this has slowly been equalizing. The pressure, the atmosphere has slowly been working its way into this reservoir over the course of 5 years. It's been going down. And then here I come with a C-clamp or whatever. I use a C-clamp to compress mine. And I'm trying to force 5 years of air back up into that master cylinder in one day, or in one setting, within 20 minutes, I'm going around and shoving all that air back. Now that air has nowhere to go, and it's going to build up in here. And as I'm doing that, it's harder and harder and harder for me to compress my calipers, because I'm forcing the air to compress, because air is compressible. I'm compressing it in the top of this reservoir, and it's either working its way out slowly or it's not. I don't know. I mean, I would imagine if you're compressing it, then that air is going to hit that cap and probably push its way out. But some of it can probably compress to a point. But even worse, let's say someone at some point added brake fluid. I don't know if they did. That brake fluid hits that, and then everything's going to stop when the brake fluid hits that cap. Whereas if I were just to loosen the cap and some point someone added brake fluid, then that brake fluid will spill out and run down the engine bay. And even though brake fluid eats up paint, there's really no damage to the body if brake fluid were to run down the engine bay. So that's why I've always loosened my brake fluid cap before compressing my calipers, because sometimes you compress the caliper and it just doesn't want to let go because there's a ridge on the rotor and the brake pad's kind of worn into it, and you're trying to get the caliper off and you're fighting it, and somehow there's just a little bit of air pressure inside of that system, and it's just ever so slightly pushing that piston back out at you. So in doing so, my whole thought process of loosening this cap is to allow maybe, 5 years of air and equalization of pressure as this wears down slowly, allowing all that air to just push out easily back into the atmosphere, instead of trying to fight when you're turning that C-clamp or whatever tool you're using to compress your calipers, and you're fighting it, and it should be easy. You should just be turning it, and it should just be easily going back in, and you shouldn't require a lot of force to get the piston of the caliper to compress. And furthermore, without anywhere for that fluid to go, you're compressing the caliper on one side and you're applying the calipers on all the other sides. So if you open up the cap and make the path of least resistance, the fluid to make its way easily back into the reservoir, then it's easier for you to compress all the calipers without pushing the other pistons back as you compress the next piston. And I can say in my time of loosening, the cap on the master cylinder, I've never really had too much pushback on the other pistons. At least I don't recall even considering that being an issue, because it's never really been an issue. It's never been something that I had to think about, where like I'm compressing this side and then this side slowly reapplying the brake, because I'm applying a pressure into the system and there's nowhere for it to go, so it applies the brakes. Whereas if the cap's open, then the path of least resistance is going to be back into the reservoir. So in talking to some friends about doing this, loosening this cap, they didn't necessarily say that you can't do it, but there's some things to consider. Like, number one, you're allowing potential dirt to get into the system, and you're opening a system. So maybe a speck of dirt falls in. As we know, we should clean the cap before we open it up. But you also introduce the possibility of you forgetting to put that cap back on. Maybe you go for a test drive, you start bouncing around, and all that brake fluid starts spilling everywhere. Or the customer comes, picks up his car, and here you are, you forgot to close the cap. So it opens up a room for error, because now you're messing with the cap. You got a lot of stuff going on. You're doing all these different things, and you forget that cap. So, for me, I've got to remember every single time I service, my brake pads, to go ahead and open the cap and make sure I close the cap again. Now, another thing to consider is if the brake system is going to last 5 years, then the brake fluid after 5 years is going to be time to service that brake fluid to be doing things correct. I mean, you're probably a little late on servicing your brake fluid. Well, at that point, when you service your brakes, brake pads and everything, you should technically flush the brake system. So at the end of the day, by the time this truck needs brakes, it's going to need brake fluid service anyway. So the whole system should technically get bled out, and all the fluid should be changed out at the time of changing out the brakes, if you really want to do it right. Although A lot of people never changed their brake fluid for the life of the vehicle and never had an issue. You do start to have diminished quality. Like the brake fluid, it's starting to get worn after 5 years. It's starting to lose its boiling point, meaning that its boiling point is lowering and lowering. And it might still work, but it's real hot. You might get to like a real hot day, and you might be towing a trailer, and you might notice a little bit of brake fade. So, it is important to consider, should you flush out the brake fluid? Well, you probably should. And then what I've noticed having some higher mileage trucks in the past is the calipers start to fail. First the rears and then the fronts. And once that starts happening, eventually every caliper in that vehicle is going to fail. You start seizing up in the rear. I'm willing to bet all that brake fluid, it's not going to be long before you're doing the fronts. Maybe a year, maybe 2 down the road. Now you're doing the fronts. So slowly, if you've had an old truck, maybe you've experienced this, maybe not. But you start replacing the caliper, and you go, well, I'm just going to do the one that seized. Well, it's a high mileage truck. The others might not be far behind. So in those situations, maybe you flush the whole system, and maybe you continue to get life out of them. But I think if you don't flush the system, at that point, you're going to start having more caliper failures. I mean, that's what I would think. But comment below. I'm going to wrap this up. But comment below and let me know what your thoughts are on opening the brake fluid cap in order to allow that piston, the brake piston, to compress easily and allow the fluid to make its way back into the cap. I've read about this now online. Now that I'm thinking about it, there were some forums and stuff. One guy said that he blew his seals on his caliper pistons, and a lot of other people said that they've never opened the cap and it's not necessary. So comment below. Let me know your thoughts. Any mechanics out there that do this or mechanics that don't do this. I know it's controversial, but that's why I've always done it. Maybe I'll mess around and see how it is compressing calipers without opening the cap, because I've just always done it. So I don't even know. Like, I've never tried to compress my calipers with the brake fluid cap closed. I've always opened it. They've always compressed easily. I'm never fighting a clamp or anything to try to compress a caliper. It always just goes in, no problem. With just a turn of the hand, just easily goes in. I'm never wrenching on it, never putting any kind of force to compress a caliper. So maybe I'll try to leave the cap closed. I'm sure it wouldn't hurt the piston on the caliper. Maybe I'll leave it closed and compress it and see if there's any difference. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. It does happen from time to time. But comment below. Let me know your thoughts. My name is Sean. This is DS Trucks. This is our 450. We got tons of videos on this truck. It's got the limitless strobing headlights on it. I got mine on a wireless remote where I can change the pattern with the press of a button. I can switch out the pattern. Right now the C-rings are off because it's been sitting. After it sits for a minute, the C-rings turn off, but I got it wired up with the wireless remote and on the upfitter switch as well. So if I'm driving and I just want to flash a friend, this is cool because you can flash a friend. Like, you see your buddy driving down the road, you give him a quick flash and turn it off, and then he can't flash you back because he don't got all this. So he just waves at you. But I got my module. This is my wireless module right here. Slick spot. If you want to mount something in your truck, there's a slick spot for you. Right up under the hood. Right by the hinge. There's some dead space. You can zip tie something in there. There you go. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up. My name is Sean. This is DS Trucks. See you in the next video. Over and out.